Today is the anniversary of some very difficult experiences that I had annually for almost, I tell you, almost a quarter of a century. No, not to worry, not to worry. I don't want to scare you, because each year it turned out to be okay. But the issue came up again and again and again, every year, exactly on this date, the 8th day of the month of Av. Look, let me tell you, for 23 years of my life, I was director of Jewish overnight summer camps. Not just camps for Jews, but Jewish camps with deep Jewish and Zionist content, ranging from Herzl Camp to Alonim to Camp Ramah. Jewish content was intermingled with lots of fun, swimming, hiking, baseball, scores of games, singing, dancing, acting in stage plays. You know, I called it joyous Judaism. The one thing that I, as a camp director, could not control was the calendar, which had only one major Jewish event during the entire summer: the sad, cheerless, depressing Tisha B'Av, the painful commemoration of the destruction of both the first and the second temple in Jerusalem. I mean, my task was to make each of those kids very happy, excited to be there, thrilled with every experience. Well, you know it well. Too many Jews ignore Tisha B'Av. Very few fast on that day. Regrettably, most Jewish children are not even exposed to the huge historical cataclysm of Babylonian and then the Romans, how they destroyed Jerusalem, not just the physical structure of our temple, and that, of course, is in Jerusalem, but their clear intent to wipe out the entire Jewish population from the face of the earth. So often, a new group of campers arrived at camp just a few days before Tisha B'Av. Our formula was to try to make these kids happy, make them feel great from the moment they stepped off that bus. So with fun activities in mind, how in the world can we get those new arrivals ready for a day of despair? Tisha B'Av, a time of despondency and of sorrow. Look, my good friends, it was much easier at camp than it is these days in the real world. I don't want to compete with our Chazan, our good cantor, but when those youngsters, when they sang Al Naharot Babel, Al Naharot Babel, Sham Yashavnu Gam Bachinu, Bezochlenu et Zion, Bezochlenu et Zion. By the waters of Babylon, there we sat and we remembered Zion. When they sang that song, those campers knew and identified with our ancestors. I mean, those who lived in a strange land of Babylonia, even in forced exile. Our people created what today we call synagogues in Babylonia and acknowledged being in exile, remembering that Jerusalem was their ultimate spiritual home. You know, at camp, in small sikha group, discussion groups, we encouraged those youngsters to answer the question that Jeremiah posed in Lamentation, that which we'll read tonight. Ma aidech, ma demech lach habat Yerushalayim. To what can I compare you, O Jerusalem, whose misfortune can equal yours, that I might comfort you, I, God, may comfort you, O Zion. For your destruction is as vast as the ocean. Who can heal you? We'll be reading that tonight. And on it went. Campers to whom Tisha B'Av had been a strange, strange notion, now identified with Zion, with the modern state of Israel, and thrilled that Jerusalem is now a united city, totally ours. So when we solved that problem, our campers were inspired. I'm going to tell you, they learned much. Their hearts reached out to their ancestors' land, and more than anything else, they closely associated themselves with Zion, with Jerusalem, with modern Israel. I gotta tell you, I solved that problem at camp. Regrettably, I'm sorry to tell you, we haven't solved that other problem, a more specific one, a challenging issue on which you, each and every one of you, is involved, and maybe you can help solve it too. So by now you know, my reference to Tisha B'Av is very timely because it begins tonight. See, helping those Jewish youngsters at camp connect with our past and anxious to be an active part of our future was much easier than getting the bulk of today's Jewish adults to feel enthusiastic, to be active on behalf of Israel, to vote for pro-Israel politicians, to give of their means to Zionist causes. I mean, look, you heard the news, the evidence came out even this week. A survey showed that 25% of Jewish voters believe that Israel is an apartheid state. 34% said that Israel's treatment of Palestinians parallel racist activity here in America. Look, we live in a world where anti-Israel and anti-Zionism combined with anti-Semitism is so ripe. Just days ago in Beverly Hills, scribbled on a sidewalk, a swastika was found with the words Nazi pride, Beverly Hills. As Jeremiah so succinctly said in the text of Echa, which we will be reading tonight. Patzu alaych pihem kol oivaych. All your enemies open their mouths against you. You know it. The United Nations. The United Nations votes against Israel dozens and dozens of times, accusing it of human rights violations, while totally not just ignoring what Assad in Syria has done, gassing countless innocent people to death, but voting to have Syria on the Human Rights Commission. Now, look, no politics here, no politics. But I can't ignore that our current administration has actually canceled the fund establishing the Abrahamic Awards, peace between Israel and Arab countries. They canceled the fund intended to further encourage day-by-day business relationship between Jews and Arabs and Muslims. Yeah, I did my job at camp, but I'm failing miserably here today when it comes to influencing today's Jews to be involved, to be concerned to be proactive on behalf of the one and only Jewish state that was so miraculously created after 2,000 years of exile. Look, where is the Jewish voice calling out with no fear of retaliation to counter such activities? Why are we sitting so idly by when school teacher unions go out of their way to denounce the state of Israel and urge people not to purchase products of Israel? You know, look, you think in their classes, you think all they teach is 2 + 2 is 4? Don't you think that comes through in that classroom? How about Bernie Sanders and the so-called quartet, whose anti-Israel voices in Congress is heard so often, painfully and embarrassingly? I remind you that documents signed by 100 rabbinic students in which they stood on the side of the Palestinians and Hamas during this last terrible exchange of rockets and bombs between Israel and Gaza. I don't get it. Those rabbinic students decried what they termed Israeli occupation of Palestine, and their suffering, without, mind you, without a single word of concern for what Israel and its citizens have suffered at the hands of those terrorists. They gave Hamas a tall stool on which to stand. Ahavazion, the love of Zion, wasn't there. Jerusalem as the eternal capital of Israel wasn't there. The need to be strong in Israel's defense was not in that letter. Only concerns for Palestinians and rejection of what these rabbinic students call the occupation. So thankfully, very thankfully, along came a letter written by Rabbi Bradley Artson, head of the Ziegler Rabbinic School. An extraordinarily meaningful letter decrying that statement, published by those 100 rabbinic students. I commend Rabbi Artson's detailed response. It was so concise, it was so meaningful. At the end, Rabbi Artson suggests that those rabbinic students have a right to their views, invites them to discuss them in dialogue. Sure, look, who can deny open discussion? But these potential rabbis who may or may not be convinced to change their posture, some may find their way to congregations and tout those views. So even in free dialogue, I tell you, I think there are limits. Just to make a point of this crucial situation, if any of those students would agree with all of Jewish tradition, but suggest, like the Palestinians do, and therefore the Palestinians, but suggest that all of Jerusalem is not the eternal capital of Jerusalem, as we articulate on Tisha B'Av, they agree with Hamas on that? That view would be beyond the scope of just another debate. That'd be crossing the red line. I say, let's take an uncompromising stand. Deny them membership in rabbinical assembly. Do not enable them to serve as rabbis in our community. Look, no two things are alike, but you must have heard about the rally this past Sunday in Washington, D.C., decrying anti-Semitism. Scores and scores of Jewish organizations co-sponsored that rally. but 4 stood aside. They refused to join in. J Street, Peace Now, Jewish Voices for Peace, and the organization known as If Not Now. Their rationale? They claim to oppose anti-Semitism, but they do not connect it with being anti-Israel. They refuse to march with other Jews because those other Jews, they were supporters of Israel and, of course, of Jerusalem. So Tisha B'Av that begins tonight, by the way, Sinai services will be at 9 p.m. online. Tisha B'Av may not be the best known item on the Jewish calendar, but today I tell you it has huge, huge significance. That song, Al Naharot Bavel, by the waters of Babylon, there we sat and wept as we remembered Zion. How many Jews today remember Zion? How many Jews today consciously, actively respond to the scores of anti-Israel events, be they the United Nations or teachers' unions or dock workers in American ports who refuse to unload cargo from Israeli ships? That's to name a few items. Look, Tisha B'Av is more than a day of fasting. The clear message is for every Jew in the world to remember Zion, to defend it, to fight for it, just as our forefathers did, and just as we did some 73 years ago. So let's be practical. We can correct the process. We can correct it by educating ourselves even more about Judaism and Jewish values. If, for example, we cheer youngsters who celebrate their bar mitzvah, instead of saying, Mazal Tov, you are now bar mitzvah, you finished your studies. Instead, we should say, Mazal Tov, you're now bar mitzvah now. You can now finally start your real study of Judaism because you now are mature. Again, let's be practical. Jewish education is not cheap. Good Jewish education is expensive. Does the Jewish Federation assign sufficient funds to shore up that process in our Jewish schools, to enable many, many more of our youngsters to learn more, not just about 8 candles of Hanukkah to compete with Christmas, but the deep, significant, meaningful values of Jewish faith in our homeland, Israel. You see, today, literally, we turn a new page. We certainly can do so as we did with today's Torah reading when we turn to a new book, the 5th book of Dvarim. Commemorating Tisha B'Av teaches us a powerful, powerful lesson. They tried to destroy us, but now 2,000 years later, tell me, where are the Babylonians? Where are the Romans? But here we are, 2,000 years later, with a nation rebuilt by all of us, Jews around the world, Zionists. So let's make real the meaning of our traditional prayer. Ki mitzion teitzei Torah. For out of Zion come forth the Torah. Udvar Adonai Yerushalayim, and the word of God from Jerusalem. We need our Torah. We need Zion. We need Jerusalem. So let's talk reality. These days, how do we remember Zion? I say, in very practical terms, join Hadassah, join the Zionist organization, become active in AIPAC, and then write a check to the American Friends of the IDF, make a contribution to Magen David Adom, the Israeli equivalent to Red Cross, and so many other causes in Israel. Certainly contact your congressional representative and urge him or her to vote in favor of pro-Israel legislation. Remember Zion in real terms. I realize that, many things have changed since I first delivered my sermon on this pulpit some 48 years ago. So now I make another suggestion for change. Let us, on this eve of Tisha B'Av, each and every one of us, let us honestly and with conviction say, Al Naharot, Los Angeles, Na'amod b'chizuk b'zichronenu et Zion. By the waters of Los Angeles, let us stand firm, and we shall always remember Zion. Let us remember Zion. Shabbat Shalom.